Buckle up for a chilling journey into the heart of the American frontier, where trust turned deadly, and a single discovery unraveled a web of calculated cruelty. This is the haunting story of Elias Thompson and the 25 souls who vanished in what locals still call the Reaper's Trail. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover one of the darkest mysteries of the Old West. Let's dive in. Deep within the territorial records of Montana Plains lies a file that officials sealed for over 50 years. The case of Elias Thompson and the 25 souls who vanished during what locals still whisper about as the Reaper's Trail. On January 10, 1879, 26 people departed from Fort Benton, heading west toward the newly established settlements near present-day Missoula. 4 days later, only one man stumbled back through the gates, frostbitten, delirious, and clutching a leather pouch filled with gold coins that didn't belong to him. The survivor's account of wolves, blizzards, and heroic attempts to save his companions satisfied investigators for exactly 2 months until a trapper named Amos Carter discovered something in a remote canyon that made territorial authorities question everything they thought they knew about survival, loyalty, and the lengths a man will go to claim what isn't his. What Carter found in that canyon didn't just solve the mystery of the missing pioneers. It revealed a calculated cruelty that shocked even the hardened lawmen of the Montana Territory. The Montana Territory of 1879 buzzed with the electricity of impending statehood and the promise of free land under the Homestead Act. Fort Benton, positioned strategically along the Yellowstone River, served as the final outpost before the vast expanse of prairie that stretched endlessly toward the Idaho border. Here, families gathered supplies, hired guides, and made final preparations before venturing into territory where the nearest neighbor might be 60 miles away, and winter storms could bury a homestead under 15 feet of snow overnight. Elias Thompson had built his reputation over 6 bitter Montana winters. A Swedish immigrant who spoke English with only the faintest accent, he possessed an uncanny ability to read weather patterns and navigate by stars when landmarks disappeared beneath snow. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of splitting wood and hauling supplies, Elias moved through Fort Benton's trading post with the quiet confidence of a man who had never lost a party to the elements. His pale green eyes seemed to catalog every detail: the weight of supply wagons, the quality of winter clothing, the nervous laughter of children experiencing their first Montana winter. The families who hired him that January represented the dreams and desperation that drove westward expansion. James and Abigail Larson brought their 3 young daughters along with Abigail's elderly mother, Esther Caldwell, who insisted she wouldn't die in some crowded eastern city when free land awaited in the west. The Carter brothers, Levi, Noah, and Isaac, pulled their savings from 4 years of railroad work to claim adjacent homesteads where they planned to raise cattle and barley. Young physician Dr. Benjamin Foster traveled with his pregnant wife Clara and their twin boys, carrying medical equipment and a collection of books he planned to use in establishing the territory's first proper hospital. The Sullivan family had perhaps the most compelling reason for leaving civilization behind. Daniel Sullivan, a former Union cavalry officer, hoped the isolation would help his eldest son Thomas recover from what doctors politely called soldier's heart. The trembling hands and night terrors that plagued the young man since his return from conflicts with the Shoshone. Elias studied each family with professional interest, noting their resources, their desperation, and most importantly, their trust. He quoted reasonable prices for his services, $60 per family, payable upon safe arrival at their chosen homestead sites. What none of them realized was that Elias had spent the previous autumn scouting locations that served a very different purpose than homestead sites. The morning of January 10th dawned clear and cold, with temperatures hovering near zero. An unusual warmth for mid-January that Elias assured his clients would make for easier traveling. The party assembled before sunrise. 6 families, 25 souls ranging in age from Abigail Larson's 5-year-old daughter, Lily, to Esther Caldwell's 74 years, plus their guide. Wagons creaked under the weight of seed grain, farming equipment, medical supplies, and the precious few personal belongings that survived the ruthless culling required for frontier life. Elias loaded his own supplies with practiced efficiency: canvas tarps, rope, lantern oil, and a collection of tools that the families assumed were for emergency repairs. Hidden beneath legitimate supplies lay items that served a darker purpose. A small spade, extra blankets that he claimed were for emergencies, and a detailed map marked with locations that weren't homestead sites. As the party departed Fort Benton, following the frozen Yellowstone River westward, Elias pointed out landmarks and shared stories of successful homesteaders who had carved prosperous lives from the unforgiving prairie. His confidence was infectious. Even Esther Caldwell, who had complained bitterly about leaving her church community in Wisconsin, began to speak hopefully about the vegetable garden she would plant come spring. None of them noticed that Elias kept checking a small compass, or that the route he chose deviated slightly from the established trail markers. The families were too busy managing their children, soothing nervous livestock, and marveling at the endless expanse of snow-covered grassland that stretched to every horizon. By the second day, when the established trail should have curved south toward the settlements near present-day Missoula, Elias announced that he knew a more direct route, a shortcut that would save them 3 days of travel. The decision seemed logical. Supplies were holding out well, the weather remained stable, and everyone was eager to reach their destinations before the next storm system moved through. That shortcut led them directly into the most remote section of the Bitterroot Badlands, where deep gullies and rocky outcroppings created natural barriers that would hide whatever happened next from the rest of the world. The storm struck on the 4th day with the sudden violence that only Montana blizzards can achieve. One moment the party traveled under an overcast but manageable sky. The next, wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere feet, and temperatures plummeted to 25 below zero. Elias called for the wagons to form a protective circle, standard procedure for prairie travel. But instead of sheltering in the center, he guided them toward what he claimed was a natural windbreak in a nearby canyon. Dr. Foster later described in testimony that was never made public the growing sense of unease he felt as Elias led them deeper into terrain that offered no shelter from the howling wind. The windbreak turned out to be a box canyon with steep walls that funneled the storm's fury directly down upon the huddled families. When James Larson suggested they should return to higher ground and wait out the blizzard in the open prairie, Elias insisted that moving in such conditions would be suicide. "The storm will break by morning," Elias assured them, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We just need to keep the children warm through the night." But the storm didn't break. For 72 hours, the families huddled in wagons that provided little protection from wind that drove snow through every crack and crevice. Food supplies, carefully rationed for the journey, began to run dangerously low as the delay stretched into a 4th day. More alarming still, several family members began showing signs of frostbite despite their best efforts to stay warm. It was during this 3rd night that young Thomas Sullivan, already troubled by his war experiences, began to notice inconsistencies in their guide's behavior. While the families grew increasingly desperate, sharing blankets and body heat to survive, Elias seemed remarkably well prepared for the extended delay. He had extra food in his personal supplies, additional firewood that he claimed to have gathered before the storm, and most puzzling of all, he appeared to know exactly where to find shelter. When nature calls became unavoidable, he moved through this canyon like he's been here before. Thomas whispered to his father during a brief lull in the wind. "Look how he goes straight to that rock formation when he needs to attend to business. No hesitation, no searching around." Daniel Sullivan, exhausted from helping maintain fires and care for the younger children, initially dismissed his son's observations as the paranoid thinking that had plagued Thomas since the war. But as the 4th day wore on, Daniel began to notice things himself. Elias never seemed to struggle with finding dry firewood despite the fact that the storm had soaked everything in sight. His personal supplies never seemed to diminish, even as he generously shared with families whose provisions were running out. Most disturbing of all was Elias's reaction when James Larson suggested sending out a small party to search for better shelter. The guide's usual calm demeanor cracked just enough to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "No one leaves the group," Elias stated firmly. "In weather like this, separated from the party means death. I've seen it happen too many times." When Dr. Foster offered to accompany any scouting party, citing his responsibility to the pregnant Clara and the other vulnerable members of the group, Elias's response was even more troubling. "Doctor, you're needed here. Besides, I'm the only one who knows these Badlands well enough to navigate safely. Trust me, I've guided families through worse than this." The problem with Elias's reassurance was that he had specifically chosen this route as a shortcut that would avoid the Badlands entirely. The contradiction wasn't lost on those who were still thinking clearly despite the cold and hunger. On the morning of the 5th day, Elias made an announcement that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. He claimed to have spotted smoke in the distance, possibly another party of travelers, or perhaps a trapper's cabin where they could find shelter. "I'll scout ahead alone," he said, "and return within 8 hours with news. Keep the fires burning and stay close to the wagons," he instructed. "If I'm not back by sunset, send up 3 smoke signals, and I'll find you." Elias departed on his horse, carrying only a light pack and his rifle. What he didn't tell the families was that he was heading toward a cache of supplies he had hidden the previous autumn. Supplies that would sustain him comfortably while he waited for nature to eliminate the witnesses to his next crime. The families never saw Elias Thompson again. By sunset of the 5th day, they were burning wagon wheels to maintain enough heat to keep the children alive. By the morning of the 6th day, they faced the terrible choice between staying put and hoping their guide would return, or abandoning the wagons and attempting to reach civilization on foot through snow that was chest-deep in places. Esther Caldwell, the eldest member of the party, made the decision that sealed their fate. "He's not coming back," she stated with the brutal honesty of someone who had lived through 8 decades of human nature. "Something's happened to him, or—" She didn't finish the thought, but everyone understood the implication. They chose to wait one more day, or— Elias Thompson's return to Fort Benton on January 16th created a sensation that rippled through the territorial communities along the Yellowstone River. Stumbling through the gates just after dawn, frostbitten and incoherent, he collapsed before the commanding officer and uttered words that would be recorded in official reports and repeated in whispered conversations for decades to come. "They're all gone. The wolves. Dear God, the wolves." The story Elias told once he had recovered sufficiently to give a coherent account painted him as a tragic hero who had watched helplessly as nature claimed the lives of 25 innocent people. According to his testimony, the storm had been worse than anything he had experienced in 6 years of guiding parties through Montana territory. Despite his best efforts to find shelter and maintain morale, the extended cold had weakened the group to the point where they became easy prey for a pack of wolves that had been driven from their usual hunting grounds by the same storm. "I tried to fight them off," Elias sobbed to Territorial Marshal Henry Dawson, displaying genuine tears and wounds on his hands that appeared consistent with his story. "But there were so many, and the people were too weak to run. The Larson girls, dear Christ, the sound they made." Elias's account included precise details about the storm's progression, the location where they had sheltered, and the individual acts of heroism he claimed to have witnessed as families tried to protect each other from both the elements and the wolf attack. He spoke movingly of Dr. Foster's final moments, allegedly spent tending to the wounded even as wolves circled the group, and of James Larson's last stand, using a broken wagon wheel as a weapon to defend his daughters. The story was compelling, tragic, and completely believable to men who had witnessed the Montana Territory's capacity for sudden, merciless violence. Marshal Dawson, himself a veteran of Indian campaigns and prairie blizzards, found nothing in Elias's account that contradicted his understanding of how quickly disaster could strike isolated travelers. More importantly, Elias had physical evidence to support his claims. The leather pouch he clutched when he arrived at Fort Benton contained exactly the amount of money the families would have carried, their combined savings for purchasing supplies and paying filing fees for their homestead claims. Elias explained that he had gathered the money from the bodies, intending to ensure it reached the family's relatives back east, rather than enriching scavengers who might eventually discover the tragedy. "It seemed the least I could do for them," Elias explained. "James Larson made me promise before the end that I would see his family's savings returned to his brother in Chicago." The territorial authorities organized a recovery expedition within days of Elias's return, but the late January thaw had begun, making travel treacherous and limiting the search to areas accessible by horseback. When the party returned after a week in the field, they reported finding scattered evidence of the tragedy: scraps of clothing, broken wagon parts, and disturbed snow that could have been the site of a wolf attack, but no bodies. Marshal Dawson explained the lack of remains in terms that made perfect sense to anyone familiar with frontier life. Wolves don't leave much behind, especially when they're desperate from a hard winter. The scavengers would have cleaned up whatever the pack missed. Elias Thompson was officially cleared of any wrongdoing and praised for his survival skills and his efforts to honor the victims' final wishes. He used the family's savings to purchase a homestead of his own, claiming that he intended to establish a memorial to the lost pioneers by creating the kind of prosperous farm they had dreamed of building. For 2 months, Elias's story stood unchallenged. He had settled into his new property, begun planning spring planting, and even spoken with the territorial newspaper about establishing a guide service that would emphasize safety and proper preparation for prairie travel. Local citizens pointed to Elias as an example of how tragedy could inspire a man to build something meaningful from loss. Then Amos Carter made his discovery. Carter was a German immigrant who had spent 4 years trapping beaver and mink along the tributaries of the Bitterroot River. Unlike the farmers and townsfolk who had accepted Elias's story, Carter possessed intimate knowledge of how both wolves and humans behaved in the Montana Badlands. More importantly, he had been in the area during the January storm and knew that Elias's description of the weather patterns didn't match what had actually occurred. Following his trap lines through a remote canyon approximately 50 miles from the site Elias claimed for the tragedy, Carter discovered what would later be described in territorial court documents as evidence of human habitation inconsistent with emergency shelter. Hidden beneath a rocky overhang protected from wind and snow, someone had constructed an elaborate camp equipped with enough supplies to sustain several people for weeks. The camp included items that had clearly been placed there before the storm. Dry firewood cut and stacked in precise rows, canvas shelter materials designed for extended use, and most damning of all, a cache of food supplies that far exceeded what any prudent guide would carry for emergency use. Someone had prepared this site as a deliberate refuge, not a chance discovery. More troubling still were the personal items Carter found scattered around the camp: a child's mitten bearing the initials LL, a woman's hairpin of the style favored by German immigrants, a man's pocket watch engraved with the initials JL, James Larson's initials. When Carter brought his discoveries to Marshal Dawson, the territorial authorities faced a terrible possibility. Elias Thompson's story of heroic survival might be an elaborate fiction designed to cover a crime that challenged everything they thought they knew about frontier tragedy and human nature. The investigation that followed Carter's discovery revealed inconsistencies in Elias's story that grew more troubling with each piece of evidence. Marshal Dawson, accompanied by Territorial Judge Edward Langley and a small party of deputies, conducted a thorough examination of the hidden camp and began comparing physical evidence with the official account of the tragedy. The first major discrepancy involved the timeline. Elias claimed the storm had trapped his party for 5 days before the wolf attack occurred. However, the supplies cached at the hidden camp suggested preparation for a much longer stay. The firewood alone represented days of cutting and stacking work that would have been impossible to accomplish during the storm Elias described. More significant was the location itself. Elias had described seeking shelter in a box canyon that offered minimal protection from the elements, a decision that would be illogical for an experienced guide unless he had ulterior motives for leading the group to that specific location. The hidden camp, by contrast, was situated in an ideal shelter that would have been the obvious choice for anyone genuinely seeking to protect 25 people from a blizzard. Judge Langley, a former prosecutor from New York, ordered a more comprehensive search of the area. What his team discovered painted an increasingly sinister picture of the January tragedy. Following a trail that connected the hidden camp to the site Elias described as the scene of the wolf attack, investigators found evidence that someone had made multiple trips between the two locations during and after the storm. Boot prints preserved in patches of hard-packed snow suggested that one person, wearing the type of heavy boots Elias favored, had traveled this route at least 7 times over a period of several days. At the official tragedy site, closer examination revealed details that contradicted the story of a desperate last stand against wolves. The scattered wagon parts were arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate dismantling rather than destruction by desperate people seeking firewood. Personal items were distributed in a way that indicated systematic searching, not the chaos of a wolf attack. Most damning of all was the discovery of items that Elias had failed to mention in his original testimony. Hidden beneath a pile of rocks, investigators found a collection of valuables that the families would have carried: jewelry, additional money, and documents that proved the victims had been far wealthier than Elias's story suggested. Clara Foster had been carrying her grandmother's gold locket worth $60, a substantial sum that Elias had somehow failed to include in his account of gathering the victims' belongings. The Carter brothers had pooled their railroad wages into a money belt containing over $400, far more than the amount Elias had returned to authorities. James Larson carried not just family savings, but also a collection of silver coins inherited from his father's mercantile business. The evidence suggested that Elias Thompson had robbed the families before allowing them to die. But proving premeditated murder required understanding exactly how 25 people had perished in circumstances that their guide survived comfortably. Marshal Dawson brought in Dr. William Harper, the territorial physician who had examined Elias upon his return to Fort Benton. Dr. Harper's initial assessment had supported Elias's story. The guide showed signs of frostbite and exposure consistent with surviving a blizzard. However, when asked to reconsider his findings in light of new evidence, Dr. Harper admitted that Elias's injuries were surprisingly mild for someone who claimed to have spent 5 days exposed to severe weather. His frostbite was superficial, Dr. Harper testified, the kind you might get from spending a few hours in cold weather, not multiple days. And his overall condition: he was hungry and exhausted, certainly, but not in the state I would expect from someone who had endured the ordeal he described. The investigation took a crucial turn when deputies decided to search Elias's homestead for additional evidence. What they found in the root cellar of his new property shocked even experienced lawmen who had dealt with frontier violence for years. Hidden beneath sacks of seed grain, Elias had concealed items that clearly belonged to the missing families. Children's clothing still bearing the scent of the lavender Clara Foster used to make her sons feel special on Sundays. Dr. Foster's medical bag containing instruments that Elias could never have afforded to purchase. And Abigail Sullivan's wedding ring, a distinctive Celtic design that her husband had described in detail when providing information about the victims. But the most disturbing discovery was a detailed journal that Elias had kept throughout the winter of 1878-79. The journal revealed that the January tragedy had not been an opportunistic crime born of desperation, but the culmination of months of careful planning. Elias had spent the autumn systematically scouting locations in the Badlands, specifically looking for sites that would be difficult to find and impossible to escape from. He had cached supplies at multiple locations, creating a network of hideouts that would allow him to survive comfortably while his victims perished. Most chillingly, the journal contained detailed profiles of potential victims, including assessments of their wealth, their likely routes of travel, and their vulnerability to manipulation. The entry for November 20th, 1878, left no doubt about Elias's intentions. The Larson family inquired today about winter passage to homestead sites near the Bitterroot. They carry substantial savings and travel with elderly mother who would slow any rescue attempts. Perfect candidates for western route through canyon system, must ensure no other guides are available during their desired travel period. Similar entries documented Elias's systematic elimination of competition among other guides, his careful cultivation of a reputation for reliability, and his detailed knowledge of weather patterns that would provide natural cover for his crimes. The final entry, dated January 6, 1879, 4 days before the tragic journey began, revealed the cold calculation behind what appeared to be frontier heroism. Weather reports indicate severe storm system approaching from northwest. Families are eager to depart before conditions worsen. Will suggest early departure and direct route through Badlands. With proper preparation, should be able to eliminate all witnesses while maintaining appearance of natural disaster. Must remember to return reasonable portion of victims' money to avoid suspicion. The evidence against Elias Thompson was overwhelming. But Marshal Dawson faced a problem that would plague frontier justice for decades. How do you prove murder when the bodies have disappeared and the accused maintains his innocence in the face of seemingly conclusive evidence? Elias's defense, when confronted with the journal and stolen property, shifted from heroic survivor to victim of circumstance. He claimed the journal entries were fabrications created by someone seeking to frame him, possibly Amos Carter himself, who might have planted evidence to claim the reward money that had been posted for information about the missing families. "That German trapper has been watching my homestead for weeks," Elias insisted to Judge Langley. "He knows I've been successful, knows I've been able to start fresh when others are struggling. He's probably been planning this since I returned from that terrible ordeal." Elias's explanation for the hidden cache of supplies was equally creative. He claimed to have been preparing a memorial expedition to properly bury the victims once spring weather made the site accessible. The supplies were intended to sustain a proper burial party, and the valuable items found in his possession were being held in trust until he could locate relatives of the deceased. "I was waiting for the right time to contact the families back east," Elias explained. "I wanted to be able to tell them that their loved ones had received a Christian burial, not just that I had failed to protect them from wolves." The story was plausible enough to create reasonable doubt, particularly since the territorial court system was more accustomed to dealing with simple cases of theft and assault than complex investigations involving missing persons. Judge Langley found himself in the uncomfortable position of presiding over a case where everyone was certain of the defendant's guilt, but the legal standards for conviction remained frustratingly out of reach. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Thomas Sullivan, the young veteran whose war-damaged nerves had made him sensitive to details that others might have overlooked. Territorial authorities had initially been reluctant to rely on testimony from someone whose mental state was questionable, but Thomas's obsession with the inconsistencies in Elias's story had led him to conduct his own investigation. Thomas had spent weeks retracing the route the party had taken from Fort Benton, interviewing anyone who might have seen the travelers or noticed Elias's movements in the days leading up to the tragedy. His persistence uncovered a witness whose testimony would finally provide the missing link between Elias's careful preparations and the victim's disappearance. Emma Carter, Amos's wife, had been checking trap lines near the hidden camp on January 14th, the day Elias claimed to be fighting off wolves while his companions died around him. From a ridge overlooking the canyon, Emma had observed a lone man moving systematically through what appeared to be an abandoned campsite, loading items onto a travois and covering his tracks as he worked. "I thought it was strange," Emma testified, "because the man was working so carefully, like he didn't want to be seen. And he wasn't acting like someone who had just survived a terrible tragedy. He moved like someone who had all the time in the world." Emma's description of the man's clothing and horse matched Elias exactly. More importantly, her testimony placed him at the hidden camp on the same day he claimed to be struggling for survival with the families. The timeline made it impossible for Elias to have been in both places, finally providing concrete evidence that his story was false. But even Emma's testimony might not have been enough to secure a conviction, if not for the discovery that terrified the investigators more than any evidence they had uncovered so far. While searching the area around the hidden camp one final time, deputies found what appeared to be a shallow grave that had been disturbed by scavengers. The remains they uncovered were not those of adults who had died fighting wolves, but of children who had clearly perished from exposure and starvation. The condition of the bodies suggested they had been alive for days after Elias claimed the tragedy had ended, possibly calling out for help that never came, while their guide systematically looted their family's possessions from his comfortable hideout. Dr. Harper's examination of the remains revealed the most horrifying detail of all: evidence that someone had provided the children with just enough food and warmth to keep them alive for several days, but not enough to save them. They had been kept alive, not out of mercy, but to serve as insurance against the possibility that search parties might arrive earlier than Elias expected. The revelation that Elias had deliberately prolonged the children's suffering transformed the case from robbery and negligent homicide to something far more sinister. The families hadn't simply been abandoned to die. They had been systematically murdered by a man who had spent months planning their destruction while smiling at their children and accepting their trust. The trial of Elias Thompson began on April 20th, 1879, in the Territorial Courthouse at Helena. What should have been a straightforward case of frontier justice instead became a legal spectacle that drew observers from across the Montana Territory and beyond. Eastern newspapers sent correspondents to cover what they sensationalized as the Prairie Demon murder trial, while local citizens packed the courthouse every day, many having traveled hundreds of miles to witness the proceedings. Elias entered the courtroom every morning impeccably dressed, maintaining the dignified bearing that had convinced 25 people to trust him with their lives. His demeanor never cracked, even as prosecutor William Baxter methodically presented evidence that painted him as a calculating predator who had preyed on families seeking nothing more than the chance to build new lives on the frontier. The prosecution's case built inexorably from circumstantial evidence to damning proof of premeditation. Baxter began with testimony about Elias's reputation and the trust the families had placed in him, then systematically demolished the heroic survivor narrative with physical evidence, witness testimony, and the damning contents of Elias's journal. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Baxter stated in his opening remarks, "we will prove that the defendant did not survive a tragedy. He created one. We will show you that Elias Thompson spent months planning the systematic murder of innocent families, that he led them deliberately into danger, and that he watched them die while he remained safe and comfortable, counting their money and planning his escape." The prosecution's most effective witness was Dr. Harper, whose medical testimony about the condition of the children's remains left several jurors visibly shaken. "Based on my examination of the remains," Dr. Harper testified, "these children survived for at least a week after the supposed wolf attack. They died slowly of cold and hunger while someone nearby possessed ample supplies to save them." Emma Carter's testimony provided the crucial link that placed Elias at the hidden camp while he claimed to be with the dying families. Her simple, straightforward account of observing a man systematically looting an abandoned campsite destroyed any remaining credibility in Elias's version of events. But it was Thomas Sullivan's testimony that provided the most compelling insight into Elias's character and methods. Despite his reputation for instability, Thomas's detailed recollections of the journey and his observations of Elias's behavior painted a picture of a man who had orchestrated every aspect of the tragedy. "He knew exactly where to go in that canyon," Thomas testified, his voice steady despite the obvious emotional cost of reliving the experience. "Even in the storm, he moved like he'd been there before. And when people started talking about leaving, about finding better shelter, he always had a reason why we should stay put. Always a reason why he was the only one who could make decisions." Thomas's account of Elias's mysterious disappearance to scout for help revealed it for what it truly was, the signal for the final phase of his plan. Once Elias left the families, they were beyond any hope of rescue, trapped in a location only he knew about with dwindling supplies and no knowledge of how to survive in the Badlands. The defense, led by attorney Charles Monroe, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the defendant's story had been systematically dismantled. Monroe's strategy focused on attacking the reliability of the evidence and suggesting that Elias had been the victim of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by people who envied his success. "My client is guilty of nothing more than surviving a terrible tragedy," Monroe argued. "He has been made a scapegoat by those who cannot accept that sometimes, despite our best efforts, good people die, and there is nothing heroic about survival, only guilt and the burden of continuing to live." Monroe suggested that Amos Carter had planted evidence to frame Elias, possibly in collaboration with other trappers who resented the Swedish immigrant's success. He argued that the journal entries could have been forged, and that the stolen property could have been planted in Elias's root cellar by anyone with access to his homestead. The defense's most effective moment came when Elias himself took the stand. Speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, he recounted the horror of watching families die around him, of hearing children cry for help he couldn't provide, and of making the terrible decision to save what money and valuables he could, rather than let them disappear with the bodies. "I failed them," Elias testified, tears streaming down his face. "I was supposed to be their guide, their protector, and I failed them. But I am not a murderer. I am a broken man who has to live every day with the knowledge that 25 good people trusted me with their lives, and I wasn't strong enough or skilled enough to save them." Elias's testimony was compelling, and for a moment it seemed possible that he might be able to create enough doubt to avoid conviction. But Prosecutor Baxter's cross-examination systematically destroyed Elias's credibility by forcing him to explain the increasingly obvious contradictions in his story. Mr. Thompson, Baxter asked, if you were truly trapped with the families for 5 days, how do you explain Mrs. Carter's testimony that she saw you alone at the hidden camp, calmly loading supplies on the very day you claim to have been fighting wolves? Elias's answer, that Mrs. Carter was mistaken about the date or had seen someone else, was unconvincing. When Baxter pressed him about the detailed preparations at the hidden camp, Elias's explanations became increasingly desperate and contradictory. The moment that sealed Elias's fate came when Baxter produced the final piece of evidence, a letter found hidden in Elias's cabin, written but never sent to a contact in St. Louis. The letter, dated February 5, 1879, discussed Elias's plans to expand his business operations to include routes through Idaho Territory, where opportunities for profit are even greater than in Montana. The letter made it clear that Elias viewed the January tragedy not as a devastating failure, but as a successful test of methods he planned to use again. I have perfected techniques for managing large groups in isolated areas, the letter read. The key is maintaining their trust while systematically eliminating any possibility of escape or rescue. The January operation yielded substantial profits with minimal risk exposure. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts, 25 charges of premeditated murder. Judge Langley, in passing sentence, described Elias Thompson's crimes as an affront to every principle upon which civilized society depends. You betrayed the trust of families who saw in you their hope for a better life, Judge Langley stated. You planned their deaths with the cold calculation of a businessman planning a transaction. You watched children die while you remained comfortable and well-fed, counting their parents' money. For these crimes, there can be only one sentence. Elias Thompson was hanged at the Territorial Prison in Helena on August 15, 1879. According to witnesses, he maintained his innocence until the end, insisting that he had been the victim of a conspiracy by jealous competitors and vengeful immigrants who could not accept that a Swedish man had succeeded where they had failed. The case established legal precedents for prosecuting complex murder cases in territorial courts and highlighted the vulnerability of frontier families to predators who exploited their trust and desperation. More importantly, it revealed the need for better oversight of the guide services that families depended upon for survival during westward migration. The homesteads that the 6 families had planned to establish were eventually claimed by other settlers, but none thrived. Locals said the land was cursed, though more practical observers noted that the remote locations Elias had chosen for his victims were poorly suited for farming and dangerously isolated from supply routes and medical assistance. The territorial government implemented new regulations requiring guides to register with local authorities and provide references from previous clients. A reward system was established for reporting suspicious behavior among frontier service providers, and territorial marshals began conducting periodic inspections of guide operations. But the most lasting impact of the Elias Thompson case was the change it brought to how frontier families approached the decision to trust strangers with their lives. The tragedy shattered the assumption that survival skills and professional reputation were sufficient guarantees of a guide's character. Families began traveling in larger groups, hiring multiple guides to check each other's decisions, and establishing communication schedules with authorities that would trigger searches if contact was lost. The personal effects recovered from Elias's cash were eventually returned to surviving relatives back east. James Larson's brother in Chicago used the family's savings to establish a scholarship fund for children orphaned by frontier tragedies. Dr. Foster's medical equipment was donated to the Territorial Hospital, where it served frontier communities for over a decade. Thomas Sullivan, whose war-damaged nerves had made him sensitive to Elias's deceptions, struggled with survivor's guilt for years after the trial. He eventually became a territorial marshal himself, specializing in investigating suspicious disappearances and missing person cases. His detailed reports from the Elias Thompson investigation became required reading for law enforcement officers throughout the Montana Territory. Amos Carter, the trapper whose discovery had exposed Elias's crimes, refused all rewards offered by the territorial government. He continued working his trap lines along the Bitterroot River, but neighbors reported that he was never quite the same after finding those children's remains. Emma Carter later said her husband would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced he could hear children crying in the wind. The site of Elias's hidden camp became a landmark of sorts among trappers and hunters who worked the Badlands. Local legend held that anyone who camped there would hear sounds of children playing in the distance, but investigators who examined these reports found they could be explained by wind patterns and the acoustic properties of the canyon system. More troubling were the persistent reports of other caches of supplies found in remote locations throughout the territory. Over the following decade, territorial authorities discovered at least 7 other sites that appeared to have been prepared for extended stays in isolated areas. None contained evidence of crimes, but their existence suggested that Elias Thompson might not have been unique among frontier guides who saw opportunity in their clients' vulnerability. The case files remained sealed until 1913, when historian Dr. Elizabeth Harper was granted access while researching frontier crime for her doctoral dissertation. Dr. Harper's analysis revealed that Elias's methods had been far more sophisticated than even the prosecution had realized. He had been operating his deadly scheme for at least 4 years before the January 1879 tragedy, and had likely been responsible for the disappearances of several smaller parties whose fates were never solved. Elias Thompson represented a type of frontier predator that we are only beginning to understand. Dr. Harper wrote in her 1915 book, Predators of the Plains, Crime and Justice in Territorial America. He exploited the very qualities that made frontier settlement possible: trust, cooperation, and the willingness to depend on strangers for survival, to commit crimes that would have been impossible in more settled communities. The financial records seized from Elias's property revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise. Over 4 years, he had accumulated wealth equivalent to what a successful businessman might earn in a decade. He had used this money to purchase multiple properties under different names, suggesting he had been planning to expand his operations throughout the Western Territories. Most chilling of all was the discovery of a detailed map found hidden in Elias's cabin wall during renovations in 1892. The map marked not just the locations of his supply caches, but also the routes used by immigrant families traveling to homestead sites throughout Idaho, Utah, and Nevada. Each route was annotated with notes about typical travel times, seasonal weather patterns, and the locations of natural shelters that could serve as killing grounds. The map suggested that Elias had been planning a campaign of systematic murder that would have dwarfed the January 1879 tragedy. If not for Amos Carter's discovery and the subsequent investigation, Elias might have continued operating for years, leaving a trail of missing families across the western frontier. The Elias Thompson case became required study material at the newly established Territorial Law Enforcement Academy, and elements of the investigation were incorporated into federal guidelines for prosecuting complex murder cases in frontier jurisdictions. The legal precedents established during the trial influenced territorial law for decades, particularly regarding the use of circumstantial evidence in the prosecution of crimes where bodies could not be recovered. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the awareness it created among frontier families about the dangers of blind trust. The tragedy served as a reminder that the qualities that enabled survival on the frontier, self-reliance, resourcefulness, and the ability to exploit others' vulnerabilities, could just as easily be turned to criminal purposes by those who lacked moral constraints. In the end, Elias Thompson's story stands as a dark counterpoint to the mythology of frontier heroism. While history celebrates the guides, scouts, and pioneers who helped families build new lives in dangerous territory, the case reminds us that among those who possessed the skills to survive in the wilderness were some who used those same skills to prey upon the innocent. The 25 victims of Elias's calculated cruelty, James and Abigail Larson and their daughters, Dr. Benjamin and Clara Foster and their children, the Carter brothers with their dreams of prosperity, Daniel and Abigail Sullivan seeking healing for their war-damaged son, and elderly Esther Caldwell who simply wanted to die as a free woman on her own land, represented the hopes and dreams that drove westward expansion. Their deaths served as a brutal reminder that the frontier's promise of freedom and opportunity came with dangers that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. This mystery shows us that the real horror of the American frontier wasn't always found in natural disasters, Indian attacks, or wild animals. Sometimes it came in the form of a trusted guide with pale green eyes and a reassuring smile who saw other people's dreams as opportunities for profit and their trust as a weakness to be exploited. What do you make of this chilling tale? Do you think the full truth about Elias Thompson's crimes has been uncovered, or could there be more victims hidden in the vast Montana Badlands? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. If this story gripped you, give it a like, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries, and subscribe with the notification bell so you never miss a tale from the shadows of history. Until next time, keep exploring the unknown with us.